One of the best ways to optimize your applications is to use symbols. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about what symbols are and how to create and use them in Flash. For this example, you don't need to follow along. You can just watch my screen and you'll see how important symbols are in Flash. So on the stage here, I have a grouped vector object. You'll notice that it's kind of complex and has a lot of gradients. Before I do anything else, I'm actually going to test the movie and preview this in the Flash player to show you the file size in the Swift History section of the Properties panel. So I'm just going to go to Control, Test Movie, Test. Now I'll point out on the Properties panel that this file is 2.2 kilobytes. Now let's say I wanted to use a bunch of these flowers on the stage. So I'm going to hold Option on my keyboard or Alt on the PC and click and drag to create many flowers. So I'll create a row, then I'll select the row, and I'll copy the row a few times. So now that I have a lot of flowers, I'll test the movie and then look at my file size. So in the Swift History panel, my latest version is 12.4 kilobytes. So the file size expands significantly each time I use a flower. So obviously 12.4 kilobytes is not a massive file size for a Swift file, but I just want to point out that my file size is increasing significantly as I add more of them. So let's delete these off the stage, and then I'm going to use a symbol. A symbol is essentially an enhanced group. So on the stage here, I have a symbol of the flower instead of just a group. Now I'll test the movie to show my file size, and you'll see that I have 2.2 kilobytes again. Now let me copy this symbol a bunch of times. Actually copying it many more times than I did when it was a group. So I'm going to cover my screen with these flowers. So now I'll test the movie, and then look in the Swift History panel, and you can see that my file size is 2.8 kilobytes. So my file size barely goes up when I use the same symbol over and over again. So by putting these objects in symbols, I can save on my file size and optimize my applications. Throughout this chapter, you'll learn what symbols are and how to use them in your applications to optimize your file size and performance. You can create a symbol in Flash in two ways. You can create a symbol based on artwork that you already have, or you can create an empty symbol and put artwork into it. In this movie, we'll take a look at both of those methods for creating symbols. On the stage here, I have a flower. I'll select the whole thing by clicking and dragging with the selection tool to create a selection area around the whole flower. I'll release my mouse button. You'll see that the shape is made up of many different drawing objects. So I'll take this and convert it to a symbol by going to Modify, Convert to Symbol. Notice that the keyboard shortcut is F8. I definitely recommend memorizing this keyboard shortcut because this is one of the most common that you'll use when you're working in Flash. So F8 to convert your selection to a symbol. For the name, I'll type a symbol name. Typically, it's best to avoid spaces when you're creating symbols, and you always want to avoid special characters like the pound sign or the @ symbol. So you want to just stick with letters and numbers and no spaces for symbol name. And keep them descriptive so you can easily find them in the library. I'll call this flower 1, no space. For the type, I'm going to choose graphic. We'll talk about other symbols in other movies. With the folder option, you can choose to put your symbols in a specified folder in the library. Since I don't have any folders in the library, I'm just going to leave library root there. And then for the registration, you can specify the XY origin for your object. In Flash, you usually want to have that be at the top left. Flash uses the top left as the XY origin of the stage, and so I like to keep most of my symbols at an XY origin of top left. Keep in mind that this actually doesn't really matter until you start writing ActionScript code to manipulate objects. So click OK, and then you have a graphic symbol. Now if you want to make copies of your graphic symbol, you can simply drag them out of the library. So I'm going to click and drag from the library onto the stage. So I have my symbol created. I'm going to undo these changes. I'm going to put this flower into an empty symbol. So I'm going to cut all the artwork once it's selected by pressing Command or Control X, and then I'm going to go to Insert New Symbol. Note that that's different from Modify, Convert to Symbol. You're going to use the Insert New Symbol command much less than the modify convert to symbol. So I wouldn't recommend memorizing the keyboard shortcut at this point. So I'll choose insert new symbol. I'll type a name. I'm going to type flower1 again. If you have that flower1 symbol in your library still, you can call this one flower2 if you want. I'll choose graphic symbol for the type and I'll click OK. And then I'm going to use the paste in place command to paste the artwork in place. So edit, paste in place. So that puts the artwork on the stage. And then to go back to the main timeline, which I'm not in right now, I'm actually working in flower1 in the symbol, as I can see at the top left of the stage. I'm going to click scene 1. I'm at the main timeline where there's no artwork because I cut the flower from the main timeline. Then I'm going to click and drag the flower from the library onto the stage. So there are two different ways to create symbols. You can go select artwork that's already created and go to modify, convert to symbol, or the F8 keyboard shortcut, or you can create an empty symbol by going to insert new symbol. Once you start to build complex applications in Flash, you're going to be working a lot with multiple timelines. When you put an object inside of a symbol, it gets its own timeline, different from the main timeline or the main stage. In this movie, we'll look at how to navigate through multiple timelines so that you can always know where you are and what you're editing. So on this stage here, I have a group. So if I select what's on the stage, you'll see group in the properties panel. Note that I am in scene 1 or the main timeline, as you can see at the top left of the screen. It says scene 1. This top left area is something you want to be checking often to know what you're editing. So it says scene 1 now, but if I double click the group on the stage, then it will say group to the right of scene 1. So Flash is telling me I'm editing a group that's inside of scene 1. Now if I select one of the flowers, you'll see that I have different symbol instances on the stage. You can tell that there's graphic symbols once you select them and look in the properties panel. So it says graphic and it says instance of flower2. I'm going to explain the difference between symbols and instances in another movie, but for now, just know we have 3 distinct instances on the stage, and they're inside of that group. Now if I double click any one of these flowers, you'll see that it says the name of the flower to the right of the group. Flash is telling me I'm editing flower2, which is inside of a group, which is inside of scene 1 or the main timeline. I can return to the group or scene 1 by clicking their name at the top of the screen. So I can click group to go back to editing the group, or I can click scene 1 to return to the main timeline. I'm going to double click the flowers to go back into the group, and then I'm going to double click another symbol to enter its timeline. So now it's saying I'm editing flower 5. Note that you're always editing the object furthest to the right. So Flash is displaying this hierarchy as it goes to the right. If you want to step backwards through the hierarchy, you can press the back button all the way at the left of scene 1. So I can step back into the group and then to the main timeline. Understanding multiple timelines is essential to working in Flash. So I recommend practicing double-clicking on objects and getting yourself lost in multiple timelines and trying to navigate back to the main timeline. As you do that, you'll get a better understanding of how Flash works and you'll feel more comfortable navigating through the files that you create. Once you've created a symbol, one of the ways to edit the symbol is through the library. So on the stage, I'll select my symbol instance, and you'll see that it's an instance of flower. To edit the flower symbol, I'll go to the library panel and then double-click the flower icon. I'm not going to double-click the flower name. That will allow me to change the name of the symbol. I want to edit the symbol, so I'll double-click the symbol icon. So now here I'm in symbol editing mode. Flash is telling me I'm editing flower. And then I can go to the main timeline by clicking scene 1 if I want. But for right now, I'm just going to make edits to the flower. Let's say I wanted to change the stem to black. To do that, I could select the different parts of the stem and then go to the properties panel and change the fill color to black. So now I have a black stem. If I go back to scene 1 or the main timeline, the instance will be updated on the stage. So now, whenever I drag an instance of flower onto the stage, you'll see that it's updated. Any change that I make at the symbol level will affect each instance. So if I go back into symbol editing mode, and I edit the leaf of the flower, I can return back to the main timeline and see that the leaf is updated in each instance. So again, one way to edit symbols is to enter symbol editing mode through the library by double-clicking the symbol's icon, and any change you make to the symbol will affect each instance of the symbol on the stage. Another way to edit a symbol is by using something called Edit in Place mode. In another movie, I mentioned how you can double-click a symbol to edit it. That was an example of Edit in Place mode. So on the stage here, I have 3 instances of symbols. And if I double-click any one of them, I will enter symbol editing mode. So you'll see at the top of the screen, Flash is telling me I'm editing flower 2. You can see the graphic symbol icon to the left of the name of the symbol. Also notice, the other elements on the stage are faded back. So I can see them, but I can't make any edits to them or select them at all. This allows me to make edits to a symbol based on its position and relationship to other objects on the stage. So this is a very useful way to edit your symbols in Flash. So if I perform any edit, like for example to change the fill color of the shape from a gradient to a solid fill, I can do that, and then I can return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1. Notice that the other instances are faded in, and I can see them, and now I can select them because I'm out of symbol editing mode. So again, to edit a symbol in place, double-click the symbol to enter its timeline. Notice that you'll see the other elements on the stage, but they're faded back, and you can't select them, so they're only there for a reference. You can make any changes that you want, then you can return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1. One thing to remember when you're editing a symbol is that if you double-click somewhere that's not on your artwork, Flash will also return you to the main timeline. So if I double-click in the pasteboard here, Flash will take me back to the main timeline. Once you start working with symbols in Flash, it's really important to understand the difference between a symbol and an instance. In this movie, we'll look at the difference between symbols and instances and how to make edits on symbols versus making edits on an instance. Let's look at the library. So I have several different symbols in the library, and I can click through them to show you. The simple difference between a symbol and an instance is symbols are stored in the library and instances are on the stage. So anything that you actually see in a published application created by Flash is an instance of a symbol. The library is never really seen, it's just a place to store your symbols. So anytime I select any instance on the stage, you'll see that it says instance of the name of the symbol. So instance of flower 5, instance of flower 5, instance of flower 2, and then again, instance of flower 2. So on the stage, there's instances, and in the library, there are the symbols. So when you're editing a symbol, and you double-click to go into symbol editing mode, and you make any change, that change applies to all of the instances of the symbol. So when I just changed the sunflower, you'll notice that the other sunflower that was on the stage updated as well, because I edited the symbol and not the instance. Things that you can do to the instance include moving and rotating and scaling. So if I wanted to take this flower on the right, as long as I don't go into symbol editing mode, and I say use the free transform tool to rotate it, the original symbol doesn't change because I'm making the change at the instance level, not at the symbol level. If I were to double click and go into symbol editing mode and then rotate the flower, then every instance of the flower would be rotated. But since I'm doing it on the main timeline, I'm only affecting one instance. So again, on the stage, you have instances. In the library, you have your symbols. When you go into symbol editing mode, edits that you make affect all instances of the symbol. And when you edit instances on the main timeline, you can use the free transform tool to move, rotate, and scale them, and they don't affect the other instances of the symbol because those changes are made at the instance level rather than the symbol level. Let's take a look at the modifications you can make to symbol instances. On the stage here, I have 4 instances of symbols. Basically, you can edit instances using the free transform tool and the settings in the properties panel. So on the stage, I have my instance selected, and I can use the free transform tool to rotate it without affecting the symbol. I can scale it, I can even skew the instance, and the original symbol is never affected. You can tell because the other sunflower is not changing as I make these edits. Again, note that I'm on the main timeline and not in symbol editing mode. So using the transform tool, you can move, rotate, scale, and skew an instance without affecting the symbol. I mentioned that you can use the properties panel to modify colors of instances. So I'll select one of the roses on the stage, and then in the color effect area of the properties panel, I'll click the style drop down to apply a color change. So I can apply brightness, which will add white or black to the instance. I can apply a tint, where I can apply a color change. Note that it's a tint, so I don't have a ton of control over how the tint is applied. I can just specify the colors I want to use, and then I can specify the tint amount. The advanced option allows you to fine-tune the color transformation on your instance, and perhaps most useful is the alpha option. This is where you change the transparency of a symbol instance. So I can click and drag it to fade it out or fade it in. So when you're working with symbol instances, these are the changes that you can make at the instance level without affecting the symbol. Again, you can make any change that you can do with the free transform tool or in the color effects section of the properties panel. When you're working in Flash, sometimes you'll want to swap an instance out with an instance of another symbol, and sometimes you'll want to duplicate a symbol. We'll look at how to do both of those in this movie. First, we'll look at how to swap an instance. So I have two roses here, and let's say I wanted to swap one out with another instance of a symbol. So in the library, I have a few different instances of different flowers. So let's say I wanted to swap this rose out with the flower 4 flower. So to do that, I'll select the rose on the stage, and then in the Properties panel, I'll click the Swap button. This opens up the Swap Symbol window. So in this window, I can just select the symbol I want to swap with, which is flower 4, and then click OK. Now flower 4 is placed there instead of the original flower. Now one of the reasons that you'd want to duplicate a symbol is because you may want to apply a transformation that can only be done at the symbol level, but you don't want to affect all the other instances of that symbol. Let's say I wanted to make a transformation to the color of the stem of the sunflower, but I don't want to affect the other sunflower. To do this, I'm going to open up the same swap symbol window. This time I'll do it in a different way. I'll do it by right-clicking the sunflower, and then I'll choose Swap Symbol. Note that there's also Duplicate Symbol if I just wanted to duplicate it. I'm going to choose Swap Symbol, and then I'm actually going to click the Duplicate button in the Swap Symbol menu to duplicate the symbol. Here I'm prompted to enter a name for the duplicated symbol. I'll just call it flower 2A. So I'll click OK, and then I'll choose to make the swap from flower 2 to flower 2A, and I'll click OK. Now I can see that this is an instance of flower 2A in the Properties panel. The one on the left is still an instance of flower 2, not flower 2A. So I'll double-click the instance on the right to enter symbol editing mode. Now any changes I make in here will not affect the flower 2 symbol because I'm applying them to the flower 2A symbol. So I'll select the stem, I'll change its color to a solid color, and return to the main timeline. Flower 2A has a solid color, and flower 2 has the gradient. So using the swap symbol method, you can swap a symbol instance out with an instance of another symbol, and you can duplicate your symbols so you can apply changes without affecting the original symbol. And you can do both of those things by selecting a symbol instance and clicking the Swap button in the Properties panel. In Flash, you can actually put a symbol inside of another symbol. That method is called nesting. This is actually pretty useful for when you want to group symbols. So let's say I have these flowers on the stage and they're all separate instances, and I want to make a bouquet of flowers. And I want to be able to easily copy that bouquet over and over again. So essentially I want to group them. So I'm going to do that by nesting a symbol. Is select the instances on the stage, and then I'm going to use the command modify convert to symbol. I'll use the keyboard shortcut F8 because I prefer that method of doing it. So for the name, I'll type flowers. I'll choose graphic for the type, top left registration, and click OK. And now I have an instance of flowers selected. So I can drag these instances out of the library to have multiple bouquets of flowers. Now if I ever want to make changes to these, I can double click the flowers to enter symbol editing mode. Inside of symbol editing mode, I can see that I have individual instances of flowers. Then I can double click a flower to enter its timeline and make changes if I want to. Note that at the top of the screen, you'll see that I am editing flower inside of the flowers symbol, which is on the main timeline, or scene 1. So I'll click scene 1 to return to the main timeline. So by nesting these symbols, I have an effective way to group them that will still maintain optimization for my application. In this chapter, we're going to be creating frame-by-frame animations, and before you create animations, it's important to understand how the timeline works. The timeline shows your document over time. So you create animations by changing the state of the stage over a period of time. So the timeline divides your document into frames. Frames represent different positions in time for your animation. You can preview an animation by clicking and dragging the playhead, which is the semi-opaque red rectangle at the top of the timeline. So I can click and drag that to preview this animation. The timeline also has some controls at the bottom that allow you to add special features, onion skin markers, the frame rate of your application, the elapsed time based on the point where the playhead is at. So if I move the playhead to frame 10, I can see that 0.3 seconds have elapsed. So what I really wanted you to take out of this is that your timeline is organized into frames, and you use the frames to create animation, which is a series of different states of artwork over a period of time. Before you create an animation, it's important to understand how frames work. In this movie, we'll take a look at frames and how you can tell which frames you're looking at through the timeline. So in the timeline, you can see that I have an animation, and if I scrub the playhead by clicking and dragging it, you can preview the animation. You'll notice that there are a bunch of different icons in the timeline. These are visual cues to show you what type of frames you're working with in Flash. So the black dots are called keyframes. These specify a change in artwork. So every time you want to make a change in your animation, you can create a keyframe, and you have control over what the artwork looks like in that frame. So you'll see, again for a keyframe, a black dot with a gray background. A regular frame has a gray background with nothing else in it. So on the girl layer, you can see that there's a keyframe on the first frame, but through the rest of the layer, you'll only see regular frames, hence the gray background. Regular frames indicate no change in artwork from the last keyframe. So I can go to any of these frames in the girl layer. Let's say I hide everything else except for the girl. I can scrub the playhead, and you'll notice that there's no change in artwork. On the last frame of the girl layer, and throughout my timeline, you'll see a gray background with a white rectangle. This indicates the last regular frame before a change. So whenever you reach the end of a set of frames, or the last regular frame before a keyframe, you'll see this gray background with a white square. But just know that it's just a regular frame. The other types of frames are blank keyframes and blank frames. These are pretty similar to regular keyframes and regular frames. If you just watch my screen, I'm going to add a blank keyframe to the timeline in the background layer. You'll notice that all the artwork disappeared at the point where I added the blank keyframe. So it's on the stage all the way up till frame 7, and then the background simply disappears. That's because I created a blank keyframe. That means a keyframe with no artwork in it. You can tell that a keyframe is a blank keyframe because it has a white background and the black outline of a circle. Blank frames indicate no change in artwork, just like regular frames, but they're white in the background, indicating that there's also no artwork on those frames. So I can scrub the playhead to preview that there is no artwork on any of these frames. And finally, when you see a white rectangle with a white background, that indicates the last blank frame before a change. So again, black dot means a keyframe, gray background means a regular frame, white box and a gray background is the last regular frame before a change. White background with the black outline of a circle is a blank keyframe. White background only is a blank frame. And white rectangle with a white background is the last blank frame before a change. Let's take a look at creating frames in Flash. I'm going to create all of my frames on the background layer. Remember that regular frames indicate no change in artwork. So if I lock every layer except for the background layer, no matter where I have the playhead, I'm going to be editing that first keyframe because there's only one keyframe on the background layer. So let's say I move the sun over and I scrub the playhead, the sun is over for the whole animation. I'm going to undo that change. Let's look at adding a keyframe. To add a keyframe, select a frame in a layer by single clicking. So I'm going to single click in the background layer, one of the regular frames, and so you'll see that it's selected. You can tell that it's selected because it has a bluish background. Here I'm going to add a keyframe so that I can change the artwork on this frame. To add a keyframe, you can go to Insert, Timeline, Keyframe. Notice that it doesn't show a keyboard shortcut for keyframe or blank keyframe, but there is a keyboard shortcut, and it's very important. Keyboard shortcut is F6, and you're going to be using this keyboard shortcut all the time, so I highly recommend memorizing it. So I'm going to insert the keyframe by pressing F6 on the keyboard. So I've added a keyframe there, and you can tell that it's a keyframe because of that black dot. So now if I move the playhead to that frame and move the sun, I can scrub the playhead to preview that I've actually animated the sun a little bit. I've moved it to the right. So now I could add more keyframes and animate the sun on each keyframe if I wanted to. But for right now, how it is just fine. Let's say I wanted to add a regular frame. For example, I may want to extend the animation in the timeline. So I can actually select frame 20 in the background layer, and I can add a regular frame by using the keyboard shortcut F5. Now I've added frames and extended the timeline. If I scrub the playhead, you'll notice that the girl disappears at frame 17. That's because all of the layers above the background layer contain the girl, and they end at frame 16. So from frame 16 through frame 20, I only have the background layer. To add a blank keyframe, use the keyboard shortcut F7. So let's say I wanted to add a blank keyframe on frame 17 in the background layer. I can single click that frame and press F7 on the keyboard. Notice those frames that were gray update to be blank frames, and where I press F7, I inserted a blank keyframe. So you can add frames to your applications using F5, F6, and F7. F5 adds regular frames. You can do that to extend the timeline. F6 adds keyframes, and F7 adds blank keyframes. In this movie, we'll look at how to select frames in Flash. This is actually a very important skill when you're working with animations. So often you'll want to select and move frames, or to copy them, or delete frames. So we'll look at how to do that so that you can feel comfortable when you're working with frames in Flash. So my main goal here is to delete this last set of frames that are kind of at the end of the timeline. So we have an animation that goes blank at frame 17. So what we want to do is delete those frames. Now there are multiple ways to delete frames. Now before we delete the frames, we'll have to select them. There are multiple ways to select frames. You can select frames by clicking and dragging. Now when you do this, I want you to click away from any frames first. So before I select any frames, the method is to deselect every frame. So I'm going to click away from all of my frames so that I deselect every frame. You can also do this below all of your layers. So you can either do it far off on the timeline where frames don't exist, or you can do it below all your other layers. So once you've deselected all your frames, you can then click and drag a selection area and then release your mouse button to select a span of frames. Another way to select frames is to shift click. So I can select one frame and then put my cursor where the last frame I want to select is and shift click to select that span. Since I just want to select this last span of frames from frame 17 through 20, I'm going to deselect all my frames by clicking at the bottom of the timeline, and then I'm going to click and drag from frame 17 to frame 20 on the background layer, and I have that span of frames selected. So now if I want to, I can move it around by clicking and dragging my selection. But of course, that's not what I want to do, so I actually want to delete it. Just wanted to show you that I could do that. And to delete the frames, you can go to Edit, Timeline, Remove Frames, or the shortcut, which is Shift F5. I recommend memorizing the shortcut because I remove frames pretty often when I'm working in Flash. So I'm going to press the keyboard shortcut Shift F5 to remove those frames. Now the timeline only lasts 16 frames. And now that we've removed those frames, let's say I wanted to delete that keyframe that I have on frame 7 where the sun moves, and I wanted to keep the sun on the left side of the screen. Now if I deleted that keyframe, then the timeline would shrink. I actually just want to take this keyframe and convert it to a regular frame. Now to do that, I can select the keyframe and then go to Modify, Timeline, Clear Keyframe. Note the keyboard shortcut is Shift F6. I would only memorize this if you plan on working with animations a lot. So I'm going to choose Clear Keyframe, and Flash will clear that keyframe and have it be a regular frame. So I recommend practicing selecting frames in Flash so you feel comfortable moving them around and deleting them before you start creating animations, so it's nice and easy to animate your objects in Flash. Now let's create a simple frame-by-frame animation. A frame-by-frame animation is an animation where you dictate what the animation will look like in each frame. You can do that by creating and modifying frames, keyframes, and blank keyframes. The first thing I'm going to do is extend the timeline to frame 16. Notice I only have one frame in my animation to start out with. So to extend the timeline, I'm going to deselect all frames by clicking at the bottom of the timeline, and then I'm going to click and drag from frame 16 at the top layer all the way down to frame 16 at the bottom layer. So you can see I still have my mouse down and I have a blue span of frames selected. And now I'll release my mouse button, and then I'll press F5 on the keyboard to extend the timeline to frame 16. We're going to start this simple animation by only animating the pedals on the bike. So I actually don't need to see any other layers. I'm going to hide all of the layers except for the pedals and the bike. Now I'm going to zoom in so I can get nice and close to create my animation. Remember that you need to create keyframes to specify a change in the artwork. I'll start by creating keyframes halfway through the animation, because in this animation we want the pedals to rotate through a full circle. So I'll go to frame 9 in the top pedals layer, and I'll shift click frame 9 in the pedals layer below it and press F6 on the keyboard to convert those regular frames to keyframes. Finally, in the bottom pedals layer, I'll select frame 9 as well and press F6 on the keyboard to insert keyframes. It's important to note my playhead is also on frame 9, so any changes that I make will affect frame 9 only, and only the layers that are unlocked. So I'll need to unlock all 3 layers for the pedals. And I'm also going to lock every other layer. So now let's do the halfway point of this animation. To do that, I'm going to use the selection tool, and I'm going to select this shape on the stage. And using the free transform tool, I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees. Now I'm going to reverse the pedals. So I'll put this pedal on top and this pedal on the bottom. So if I preview the animation, it just looks like the pedals flip over. Now the next thing to do is do the halfway point between the beginning and frame 9, and the halfway point between frame 9 and the end of the animation. So let's go to frame 5, and we'll repeat the steps to create keyframes for all the pedals layers. And I need to make my turn halfway between where it was in frame 1 and where it is on frame 9. So I'll select the middle part of the pedals, rotate it halfway. Now I'll move the pedals into place. And if I scrub the playhead, I can preview the animation. So let's go to 13 and enter the final frames for the animation. So we'll insert those keyframes and then do the final turn. Now if I scrub the playhead, I can preview the animation and the pedals rotate in a circle. So again, when you want to create an animation, you can just create keyframes at the places where you want to change your artwork, make the necessary changes, and repeat to create your animation. Once you've created an animation, you can preview it in Flash by scrubbing the playhead, or you can put the playhead at the first frame and press the Enter or Return key to get a simple preview. If you want to see what the movie actually looks like in the Flash player, you can use the Test Movie command. Remember The speed at which your movie plays is based on the number of frames that it takes up and the number of frames that display per second. You can control the frames per second in the Properties panel. That's what FPS stands for. It's important to keep in mind that even though this says 30 frames per second, that doesn't guarantee that my application is going to run at 30 frames per second. It could run slower, or in some cases even faster than what you see when you test the application in Flash. Basically, just know that this is the target frame rate. And most of the time, Flash will be pretty close to getting that 30 frames per second, or whatever frame rate you desire. But the more complicated your artwork is, the more likely that it will run a little bit slower than your target frame rate. So let's test the movie in the Flash player. And remember, you can go to Control, Test Movie, Test, or the keyboard shortcut, which is extremely important to memorize, Command or Control, Enter or Return. So I'll use the keyboard shortcut to preview the movie in the Flash player. So notice that only the pedals are moving, and it looks kind of jittery right now. We'll do some more in another movie to make the animation a little bit more fluid. But for right now, you can sit back and relax and enjoy the fact that you just created your first animation. One of the most useful tools you have when creating a frame-by-frame animation in Flash is onion skinning. Onion skinning allows you to preview frames before and or after the current frame you're working on. So let's take a look at this animation of the pedals here. If I scrub the playhead, you can see that the pedals start to rotate around counterclockwise. If I go to frame 11, I can create some keyframes. I'll create them in all the pedals layers. And I want to make this halfway between here and where it is in frame 13. So what I'm going to do that is turn on onion skinning so I can look at a preview of frame 13 while I'm editing frame 11. To do that, click the onion skin button at the bottom of the timeline. It's immediately to the right of the center frame button. That's the red one. So click the onion skin button, and then you can see a faded back preview of the next frame. Now you may not be able to see it because of your onion skin markers. The markers for onion skin allow you to control the range of frames that you see when you're editing a frame. So I can click and drag on the circle for the markers to preview more or less frames. So if I drag one marker all the way up to my current frame, I can preview only backwards or only forwards. So now I'll make the change. I'll select the middle part of the pedals, and then I'll rotate it halfway, and I'll move the front pedal to the right side, and the back pedal to the left side. So now I can complete the animation at frame 15. So I'll create some keyframes, and then I'm going to preview all of my frames. In this preview, it's a little bit hard to tell exactly where the pedals are supposed to go. But if you look at all the pedals, you can see that there are two copies of each line that sort of overlap horizontally, then here's one diagonally, and then where the current pedal position is, they kind of overlap. But this one here, the vertical line, there's only one copy, so I want to basically overlap that to complete the animation. So I'll select the center part of the pedals, rotate and move the pedals in place, and that completes my animation. So if I turn off onion skinning, go to frame 1, press return on the keyboard, I can preview the animation and see that the pedals move in a full circle. So using onion skin, you can preview frames before and after the frame that you're working on by simply clicking the onion skin button at the bottom of the timeline and modifying the onion skin markers. Similar to the onion skin feature, the onion skin outlines feature allows you to see the onion skin as, well, outlines. This is very useful for certain animations. I'm going to zoom in here, and we'll take a look at this animation of the leg. If I preview the animation, you can see that the leg goes along with the pedals. Now, if I wanted to refine this animation at all, like for example, to make the knee more connected on the last frame, I could turn on onion skinning. Now, if I'm looking at a lot of frames at the same time, it's really hard to tell what's going on. And at the same time, onion skin gives me sort of like a faded back version of my artwork, which can be really hard to see, especially if you have all of your layers showing. For extra clarity, you can use onion skin outlines. So I'll turn off onion skin, and then I'll turn on onion skin outlines, which is immediately to the right of the onion skin button. Now I just see a simple outline of that graphic. So instead of having to see that whole artwork faded back, I see a very simple outline, and it's really easy to see where the art is. So I have a clear reference that's a simple outline. So now I'll modify this leg just a little bit. So I'll rotate the leg and just match it up a little bit better at the knee. So onion skin outlines provide another way to fine-tune your animation, and you can find the onion skin outlines button immediately to the right of the onion skin button. In this movie, we'll look at a couple different ways you can copy and paste frames. What we're going to do is copy the leg in the front as the animation for the leg at the bottom. So to do that, I'm going to select all the frames for the top leg. So remember, to select frames, you want to deselect all of the frames by clicking out of the timeline and then click and drag from the start frame to the end frame that you want to select, and you have your selection. One way to copy frames is to right-click and then choose Copy Frames. I can then right-click in the leg bottom layer on the first frame and choose Paste Frames. And there I've pasted my frames. But then Flash actually automatically created some extra frames for me, so I can delete those if I want. However, if I'm working in the same timeline, I like to copy frames like this. First I select all the frames, and then I hold the Option or Alt key, and then click and drag the frames down to wherever I want to put them. And you can see the frame preview in that blue box that I have, so it's showing how much space the frames are going to take up on the timeline. I can drop them right into place and release the mouse button. And there I have copied my animation. So if I hide the leg top layer, I preview the animation, I then have the animation for the bottom leg. Granted, it's not aligned with the bottom pedal, but we have a start here. So I've copied and pasted animation by selecting the frames and right-clicking and using the menu that pops up, or you can copy frames by Option or Alt dragging your selected frames. Now let's say you had a large span of frames and you wanted to edit them all at once. In this movie, we'll take a look at how to do that. On the stage here, I have two animations of the girl's leg moving on the bike. They're actually both in the same position. So I have the leg top layer. If I hide that, then I have the leg bottom layer, and you can see that her leg is behind the bike. So there's that animation. My intent for this was to use the same animation twice, so I don't have to manually create the rotation of her leg. So let's take a look at how that works. So I want to select all the frames on the leg bottom layer and align them to the bottom or back pedal. So to do that, I'm going to turn on Edit Multiple Frames. That's to the right of Onion Skin Outline. So I'll turn on that mode, and I'm going to drag the marker the entire span of all my frames. Now I can see all the frames at once at this point, and any change that I make will happen to, of course, all of the frames. So what I'll do is do a Command A or Control A to select everything, and then I'm going to move the transformation point up and to the right a little bit. And see how mine's kind of snapping everywhere and it's not really going exactly where I want? I'm actually going to turn off Snap to Objects in the toolbar to disable that feature. So I'll move the transformation point exactly where I want, and then the legs will hinge around that point. So I'll rotate the legs downward, and then I'll turn off Edit Multiple Frames to preview. And of course it's still not in the right place, so let's just do that again. Turn on Edit Multiple Frames, select all, and then rotate downward. I'm going to uncheck Edit Multiple Frames. And hey, we're getting there, but it's not perfect. So now we have two legs, and they rotate at the same time, so it looks a little bit awkward. One thing we can do for this is to rearrange the frames to stagger the motion. So let's set that up real quick. So I'm going to select the last 4 keyframes, and I'll push them aside. Then I'll select the first 4 keyframes and push them toward the end. Now I'll move those last 4 keyframes back to the beginning of the animation and delete those extra frames created by Flash. I'm doing that Shift F5 keyboard shortcut to do that. Now this looks just about right. It looks like I just need to rotate them in ever so slightly, and that should fix everything. So I'll turn on Edit Multiple Frames, move the transformation point, rotate a little bit. I'll turn on Edit Multiple Frames, select all, move the transformation point, and rotate the legs back a little bit. Now I'll turn off Edit Multiple Frames, and the foot seems just about in the right place. So now it looks like the girl is actually riding the bike. Let's see what this looks like in the Flash player. There we go. So using the Edit Multiple Frames feature, you can manipulate an entire animation all at once. And to access the feature, you can toggle it on and off at the bottom of the timeline. In this movie, we're going to take an animation and nest it inside of a graphic symbol. Graphic symbols actually have their own timelines, not just their own layers, but they can have animations inside them as well. So we'll take this leg animation and put it inside of a graphic symbol so that we can reuse it. That's going to optimize file size, and it will make it easy to edit the animation because any changes that we make will update the front leg as well as the back leg. So again, we're going to take this front leg animation, put it in a graphic symbol, and use it for both the front and the back leg. So we'll start by selecting all of the frames in the leg top layer. So just deselect all the frames by clicking in an empty area of the timeline and click and drag the whole span of frames on the top layer. Once you've done this, right-click your selection and choose Cut Frames. Now we're going to need an empty graphic symbol to paste these frames into. So go to Insert, New Symbol. I'm going to call this Leg Animation. Remember, no spaces or special characters for symbol names. Choose Graphic for the type, and then click OK. So now I'm in a blank timeline because I'm inside of the leg animation. I'm going to right-click the first keyframe of this layer, and I'm going to choose Paste Frames. Now the animation is contained inside of the leg animation symbol. So let's return to the main timeline. Now what I'm going to do is place the leg animation onto the stage. So I'll go to the library and click and drag the leg animation from the library onto the stage. I'll make sure to put it in place so it looks right. I'll show the girl layer just to confirm that it's in the right spot. It looks like it's a little bit off, so I'm going to move it based on the girl layer. It looks a little bit better. And just note that when you have a graphic symbol animated, you need to have the right amount of frames on the main timeline. In other words, if I were to just have one frame on the timeline, we wouldn't see that animation. We would just see a static first frame of the animation. So you need enough frames to accommodate the animation in order for the animation to play on the main timeline. So I have a 16 frame animation inside of the symbol, and I have 16 frames on the timeline to accommodate that entire animation. So I have my animation in place. Just make a few more adjustments to the positioning, and there we go. Now what I'm going to do is copy this animation for the bottom layer. So I'm going to lock the leg top layer, and then put the animation on the bottom layer. So I'll just click and drag, and then use my arrow keys on my keyboard to move the leg into place. I actually want it to be in exactly the same spot as the top leg. Now, here's something that you can do with graphic symbols that is almost magical. Select the graphic symbol on the stage, and then expand the looping area in the Properties panel. This allows you to specify the starting keyframe for a graphic symbol. This way we can stagger the animation with the front leg and the back leg and use the same symbol for both. So I have the instance selected on the stage, and then in the first area of the looping section in the Properties panel, I'm going to change the first frame to 9 and press Enter on my keyboard. Notice the bottom leg goes down to the right spot of the pedal. So now, if I scrub the playhead, the animation looks just right. So I use the same graphic symbol for both. Further, with a graphic symbol, I can apply a color transformation and make it look like it's darker or faded back. I can do that by selecting the symbol, and in the color effect area of the Properties panel, I can go to the brightness setting and set the brightness to -25. That makes the back leg a little bit darker. And if I wanted to, I could move the transformation point and scale the leg in just a little bit so it's smaller as well. Now I'll preview the animation in the Flash player. So using this technique, you can cut and paste an animation and nest it inside of a graphic symbol so that you can reuse it. And to stagger the animation, select the symbol instance on the stage and edit the first frame in the looping area of the Properties panel.